And while we discuss these three pathways that begin in the retina and go all the way back to the visual cortex and then project both dorsally and ventrally along the brain, we still haven't addressed all of the pathways. There remains two other pathways. Now, our first pathway we want to consider is sometimes called the retinotectal pathway. And we want to look at it and its associated functioning. So the retinotectal pathway here contains two central elements that we'll focus on in this part of the lecture: the superior colliculus and the parvolinear nucleus. Now, the superior colliculus is the structure right here or right here, and it is the structure that receives that offshoot from the optic nerve. It has direct optic nerve input, about 150,000 synapses or axons. And the other structure that we wanted to talk about is the parvolinear nucleus, which we'll see down here. They're also associated or implicated with the associative cortexes, as we'll see later. So about 10%, or approximately 150,000 axons of the optic nerve, are diverted into this retinotectal pathway. The retinotectal pathway participates in two general functions. First, the retinotectal pathway system detects behavioral responses towards specific neurons in egocentric space. Now, so for instance, each layer of the superior colliculus contains a topographic map of the surrounding world in retinotopic coordinates. Activations of neurons in the superior colliculus will, for instance, at some particular point on this map, evoke a response directed towards that corresponding point in the retinotopic space. Now, the second general function is more specific to primates. In primates, the retinotectal pathway participates in a larger system directing eye movements. This larger system orients the eye toward a stimulus that initially appears in its peripheral visual field. It contributes to visual stability, pursuing visual objects in motion, and controlling saccades. Let's look a little more closely at the superior colliculus now. The superior colliculus receives input from the eyes via the optic nerve, as we've said. It also receives cortical feedback from the motor and frontal eye fields, which we'll look at in a little bit. Like the lateral geniculate nucleus and the striate cortex, our superior colliculus has a multi-layered structure, 6 layers, in fact. Superficial layers show sensory-related activity, so visual-related activity primarily, but there's also somatosensory and I believe olfactory. Deeper layers process motor information, while the intermediate layers integrate sensory and motor information. Now, the superior colliculus is Latin for higher hill. It's also called the optic tectum or the tectum, and especially so in non-mammalian vertebrates. Like the lateral geniculate nucleus and the striate cortex, it's a multi-layered structure and an older brain structure. The tectum constitutes the dominant visual component in non-mammalian vertebrate species like frogs, fish, and birds. So here's an example of a non-mammalian vertebrate system. You can see the retina here projects directly onto the superior colliculus and not onto a visual cortex. In mammals, where the function of the superior colliculus differs from non-mammalian vertebrates, The superior colliculus directs saccadic eye movements by coordinating retinal input with feedback from the cerebral cortex. And we'll look specifically at that system in just a bit. Even in primates, however, the superior colliculus appears to play a role in gaze shifts, attention shifts involving head movements, generating spatially directed movements like head turns and arm reaching, as well as attentional shifts absent overt movement. The superior colliculus appears not to play a role in object recognition, but it does appear to play a role in object-directed movement. Researchers have lately studied its role in blind sight. Now, blind sight refers to individuals with damage to the primary visual cortex, V1 primarily, but who nevertheless can use residual vision to guide goal-directed movements towards targets in the visually blind field without awareness of what they're doing. That is, awareness of what they're grabbing or where it is. Now, data recently suggests that a direct pathway from the superior colliculus to the ventral lateral parvolinear nucleus contributes to blind sight. It provides that goal-directed motion or vision, even though we don't have conscious vision from V1 of that area. What about that parvolinear nucleus? Well, the parvolinear nucleus is the largest nucleus in the thalamus. It receives afferents from both the optic nerve and the lateral geniculate nucleus. It projects to the motion-sensitive areas in the dorsal stream, and cells in the parvolinear nucleus exhibit complex visual responses similar to those in the cortex. Researchers believe that the parvolinear nucleus plays a significant role in creating a stable visual image across bodily movements, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Specifically, the parvolinear nucleus likely interprets the visual scene in order to facilitate visual attention and motion perception.